everybody to this panel discussion, part of the Men of Color 2021 conference. You've been engaged and participating in some fabulous conversations, discussions. We are confident that this will be an addition to that. I am joined by some phenomenal brothers as we have a conversation around the challenges we're facing in health and healthcare, and particularly around health equity. And I'm confident that we're going to share some gems with you about where we are in health and where we need to go. So I want to introduce the panel. First and foremost, my name is Michael Curry. I'm the president and CEO of the Massachusetts League of Community Health Centers. I have the honor and privilege of representing 52 nonprofit primary care healthcare organizations across the Commonwealth, providing care to over 1 million patients. For those who don't know, health centers were born out of the civil rights movement. These were activists who were following Dr. King, who were freedom riders, and decided to create community health entities born out of a vision from South Africa. That gave birth to the first health center in the country, which was in Mount Dorchester, Massachusetts, and Mount Bayou, Mississippi, 2 locations. Similar, but very different: poverty, lack of opportunity, economic opportunity, and so many other challenges that we're still facing today. So I joined this conversation from a community health, primary care perspective, but also a civil rights, social justice background. I want to introduce our panel because I want to get right into it and have this really important conversation. First is Dr. Kirk Taylor. Dr. Taylor is currently Senior Vice President, North American Medical Affairs for EMD Serrano in Rockland, Massachusetts, managing across a cross-functional team in the fields of neurology and immunology, oncology and fertility and endocrinology. He is a senior executive in the pharmaceutical industry with over 23 years of experience in leading global teams. His breadth of industry knowledge stems from his roles as Chief Medical Officer, Chief Strategy Officer, and Senior Vice President, Medical Strategy and Operations. He is bringing a wealth of experience to today's conversation. I am also joined by Edward Walker. Edward Walker is Vice President, Medicare Product at Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Massachusetts. Ed has the rich experience of having served in 2 Blue Crosses. He, previous to his current role, served at Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Rhode Island as Managing Director, Senior Market Medicare for several years, and did a stint before that with Blue Cross and Blue Shield as Director of Market Strategy. So we want to welcome Ed to this conversation as well. And then last but not least, I want to welcome a good friend of mine, a colleague in this fight for health equity as well, Juan LaPera. Juan is the Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer at BI Leahy. He was announced just a few months ago, so we enter our roles similarly within the last few months. Juan is working on many fronts at BI Leahy, and particularly championing this notion of equity, of changing the culture, of meeting the needs of its 36,000 employees, as well as its patients in this health equity and social justice space. So we have a lot to talk about, and I want to dig right in and feel free, brothers, to even add some more context from your background and your experience that might be helpful for today's conversation. But I want to go right into one of the critical questions that I get in the spaces that you're working in. And I want to start with you, Juan. How can we seize this moment to make systemic change around health equity? And again, the high rates of infection, hospitalization, and death among Black and Brown citizens across the globe, here in Massachusetts and in Boston. We know that after George Floyd, there was an epiphany around racial justice, that we were incarcerated at higher rates, we were food insecure, we were homeless at higher rates, and that quite frankly, we're dying at higher rates of almost every disease that we could talk about today, with too many Black and Brown folks gone too soon. So that is the key question I want to start with today. How can we seize this moment to make systemic change around health equity?
Thank you, Mike, and thank you for your leadership and the great work that you do every day. I don't know frankly how you do it, but you find the time. That passion and commitment is always there. So thank you for your leadership. Yeah, I mean, it's a question that I know you and I and many others in this healthcare space are spending a lot of time thinking about, is how do we seize this moment? How do we make sure that we don't let this pandemic go by and not do something? We have seen the disproportionate impact that COVID had on Black and Latinx communities, with rates that were 3 times the average rate in terms of infection, hospitalizations, age-adjusted death rates, etc. But we know that to many of us who, and I'll use your word, who have been weathered to this type and have been accustomed to a system of care that does not meet the needs of our communities, it was not a surprise. When I saw what was happening in Chelsea, and I saw what was happening in Everett, Brockton, all the minority communities at such a disproportionate impact, it quite frankly was not a surprise. A little bit about me, I'm originally from Colombia. I immigrated at age 12, not speaking the language, living in crowded living conditions, uninsured, not trusting the systems. I use that plural, especially the healthcare system. We did turn to community health centers as the only place that opened their doors to us as undocumented immigrants. We were predisposed to many chronic conditions, asthma being one of those, low income. We were part of what we call now the essential workforce. So, that experience shed light into what was happening, and quite frankly, why it was not a surprise why Chelsea became the epicenter for the country in terms of COVID. So, how do we seize this moment? The country has finally realized that we need to do something around health equity. It cannot longer be just a research exercise, which has been the case to this date. We study health disparities, we publish them, but I'll tell you, having been in the industry for a while, I've seen those disparity dashboards that show time and time again the same disparities in diabetes and all other chronic conditions. And we're still at a place where we're in Roxbury, the life expectancy is 59 years versus Back Bay, 3 miles away, 92 years is the life expectancy. That's unacceptable for, in our region, in our backyard, to have such a difference in outcomes. So seizing this moment, I think, is then doing something about all of that. And Mike, we're spending quite a bit of time thinking about this as a collective, and we're at a moment in time now where we have representation in healthcare, specifically of Black and Latinx, and our voice collectively needs to come together and say, enough. The health equity needs to be the next chapter in health reform in Massachusetts, and quite frankly, if we do it right here in Massachusetts, we can lead the nation on this topic. And it starts with codifying health equity into health reform, how we measure health equity to hold all of our systems accountable for change, how we monitor the progress around health equity, the type of interventions that we put in place so that we can, in a culturally competent way, address issues around asthma, diabetes, all these conditions that disproportionately have impacted our communities. And then we have to spend a lot of time thinking about how we transform the workforce for healthcare delivery to be more representative of the fast-growing communities of color. So I'll pause there. I could probably go on for a lot longer, but that's how we seize the moment. We come together. We have a new generation of leaders, and I think we can act.
Thank you, Juan. Juan, you made me think, as you started with, this is not a surprise to those of us on the call today. And you made me think, and I've mentioned it to you before, I posted on my social media page, I'm glad so many people are woke and others are waking up, but many of us are insomniacs. So you're talking to insomniacs on this call, people who've been thinking around health equity for a long time, have been thinking about these social justice issues for a long time. You said something I want to pivot to Eddie on. So Eddie, you have the privilege of working on another side of this, which is the health plan side. And you have a rich experience there. But as Juan talked about, the work of collecting data and monitoring health equity. Your organization is doing some tremendous work there. But I want to toss it to you around seizing the moment to make systemic change around health equity. What are you seeing? What are you thinking? And where do you think we need to go?
So I guess I would start by saying I agree with everything that Juan mentioned. I think some of us are trying to do exactly just that, and that's take advantage of this moment to make some advancements. There are, as you alluded to, several examples of things I know we're doing here at Blue Cross Blue Shield of Massachusetts to help address the issue of health inequities. Equity is, in fact, one of our 4 strategic pillars. We have affordability, experience, quality, and inequity. And we feel we need to advance all 4 to be super honest about it. And I think our ability to do that is what leads to our competitive advantage. But you may have seen us in the news recently for a couple of things. First, we announced new incentives to encourage our provider partners to address, decrease, and eventually eliminate inequities in healthcare among racial and ethnic groups. And to our knowledge, we're the first health plan to do that. The second announcement you may have caught is we examined our own internal data, and we published this equity audit on about 50 quality measures. It's on our website. If you're listening to this and you get a chance, I would encourage you to check it out. The sad part is there were some eye-catching disparities. And I think as you both mentioned, these are things that I think we all were aware of. It's interesting when you put the data and analysis behind it and see just how big some of these gaps are. As an example from some of our analysis, we saw a 13-point gap difference between our white and our Black members when it comes to controlling high blood pressure. We saw a 20-point difference between our Hispanic and our white non-Hispanic members when it comes to antidepressant medication management. And that's just a couple of examples. We then took that information, we shared it with our provider partners so that they can see how they're performing on these metrics relative to other practices in the state. And the response has been overwhelmingly positive. I mean, we've heard consistently, yeah, we sort of knew this. And not only that, but this sort of aligns with some of the information that we have. So I think we all knew and suspected, again, there were gaps. However, some of what we identified, I would just say was really even surprising to many of us here at Blue Cross. And to be honest, quite humbling with the amount of work we have ahead of us to address this issue. I think the last thing I would say on this is, we know that some of the causes of these disparities are not simply about healthcare. They're about the social determinants of health, which can range from your housing environment to food insecurity or even access to medical care. So a range of issues. I think that over time, we'll have to take a closer look at many of these as well.
Thank you, Eddie. You made me think of a few things. So one, credit to you and your colleagues at Blue Cross for leading the way in terms of health plans and looking at these critical issues. I'm reminded of a good friend of mine, Bethia Carter from New England Blacks in Philanthropy. She always says that which gets measured, or in this case, analyzed, gets done. And that's what you're talking about, is that we did not do much of that. I would argue, just not to be provocative on this call, that oftentimes we look at racial and ethnic data, people didn't collect it, they didn't analyze it because they have to do something about it. So the way to avoid it is to not have the data. So thank you for that, Eddie. Appreciate your leadership there. And then one other thing you made me think about is the social determinants. And as Juan and I talk about all the time, 75, 80% of what is driving poor health outcomes have nothing to do with the care that you get. It's about the conditions you live in. It's about racism, food, housing insecurity. So we have to, as they say to us, Eddie, they say, well, do you want to boil the ocean? And reality is, we want to do something about health inequity. We do have to boil the ocean. It has to be about housing. It has to be about jobs. It has to be about economic empowerment. It just can't be about getting you a provider. It is really all of those combined. So great place to turn to you, Dr. Taylor. This is what you do. You've had a long career in and around these topics. And then of course, your leadership in the pharmaceutical space. I told someone recently, I was in a barbershop and people were in the barbershop debating the process of a drug coming to market. And I'm thinking, we're at the point now where people actually have a consciousness of FDA, CDC, the review process. I would never have imagined that just everyday people would be this attuned to what's happening on the pharmaceutical side. So I'd love your perspective. What do we need to do to seize the moment to make systemic change around health equity?
Yes, no, thanks for that. And thanks to everyone. I mean, what the comments already just answer the question beautifully. And the brothers here, what you're doing, I applaud you, because we couldn't get this far without any of the work that you're doing and others. Yeah, so much to say, but I'll briefly say, I want to start with the definition, equity. I think the problem is that some people think equity means equality, which means if I give you $5 and you $5 and you $5, well, we're all equal. We can now go and buy some food and everyone should be happy. But what you're getting at, and what Juan and others and Eddie are getting at, is that we're not starting at the same place in the race. So not only do you have to give me the $5, but I need the 100 for the land that you took from me. I need 1,000 for the medical care that I wasn't able to afford. I need 1 million for the injustices that my family members suffered under Jim Crow and forward. So if you give me that, then I'll be at a place where I can get the $5 and be where you are. And so there's just that imbalance there of the understanding of equity and equality, I think, is the starting point. In pharmaceutical medicine, as I call it, it's rampant. And just number one, internally, the number of folks of color, Black folks, whatever, folks of color who are in the pharmaceutical business is very small. Now, we weren't taught about it. Most doctors aren't taught in general. So imagine a fraction of this incredible opportunity that I've been afforded to get in there and actually do drug development. So, less than 4%, less than 3% in the pharmaceutical industry across the board. That's Pfizer, Merck, TGAA, all the companies. I've seen data along those lines. Then externally, you also should study, do studies, and when you're doing drug studies, and have enough patients in that look like the population you plan to serve. Because if you don't, the labels, which are averages of data, are going to have precautions, warnings, but also dosing schedules that don't include you. So that when you get the drug, when the drug is launched, you may not have the same efficacy or safety, or benefits, or even more than what was seen in the studies because you weren't there. And that comes down to the trust that I think the other brothers have already mentioned. Without the trust, we're not going in. I'm not going in. We all know Henrietta Lacks, Tuskegee, all of those different things are still percolating through the community. And I think the vaccine data, as I like to say, we're living the largest phase 3b/4 real-world evidence, real-world data study in the history of mankind, where every day we're getting new boluses of information on what's happening post the pivotal studies. Right? Those pivotal studies have been 30,000, 40,000, 50,000. We're dosing in hundreds of millions and we're seeing things. Last point, I know we need to move on. I did have the benefit, and I'm paraphrasing here, so if he doesn't get angry if he's watching this, but I did speak to one of the leads, I think vice president, senior vice president over at Moderna. I was on another panel. And I said, how did you do it? How did you get double-digit inclusion of Black folks and Latinx folks in the studies? Because, it's almost impossible sometimes, unless it's, he said, time and money and resources. We went to the fraternities, we went to the churches, we went to the community centers, we went to the trusted leaders in the community who could help bring people in and say, no, please do this, So anyway, the sister who helped to develop, if not discover, the Moderna vaccine. I mean, that's all incredible reasons and why that we can get to this health equity, not the equality, the equity through all the different work. So pharmaceutical medicine is one, but what you guys are doing are definitely part of it.
Thank you, Doctor. And you
please
brought
call me
us
Kirk,
back.
by the way. You make me feel old. No, I'm just
Well,
kidding.
Mahalia Curry would smack me in the back of the head if I called you Kirk. So she told me to put a handle on that name.
No.
But Kirk, I appreciate you. You made me think of a lot that I want to just sort of tease out. So one is, we could have started this conversation with just common terms and definitions, and equity is so important to get to a common definition of, because so many people don't get what equity is. You made me think about, for those who are from Boston and know the area, there's a restaurant bar called Slade's. And I was in Slade's one day, everybody's shaking their head because they know it's Slade's. In Slade's one day, and a good friend, Sheena Collier, tapped me on the shoulder and said, Mike, good to see you. She said, I want to introduce you to somebody. And I turned around, she said, I want to introduce you to Kizzmekia Corbett. Now, you would imagine I just met Michael Jordan in the club, because I literally turned around. I was like, I know who you are. I'm such a fan. I said, what you represent to me, Dr. Corbett, is that there's a young Black girl in Chicago right now that could find a cure for cancer, but she doesn't have the academic rigor, the social supports. That's how real this is, doctor, that there's talent we're leaving on the table, and that she represents that breakthrough. You represent that breakthrough, the other brothers on the panel. And how do we get to a place in healthcare where all of our talent can come to its maximum potential and benefit all of society? So you make me think of that. And then last but not least, I was on a panel this week, and they were talking about reparations. And Dr. Taylor, you was giving a reparations speech just now, which is you can't talk about the historical taint of race and healthcare without talking about how do you reposition a people that have been denied care. That we know in the 60s, we couldn't even get into some hospitals because they were still segregated. And that was a historical minute ago. So, Doctor, thank you so much for giving us that grounding for this conversation. I want to go back to you, Juan. You know, it took George Floyd's murder to give us an epiphany around diversity, equity, inclusion. And there's other names that people are using now: diversity, inclusion, and belonging, and others. This has been your life passion. This is what you do. When I met you and you worked at Tufts, you were already focused on this work. And now everyone's sort of catching up to you, and they're starting to think in the ways that you've been thinking for a long time. What is the approach around DEI, and how are you bringing that work to your work at BI Leahy?
Yeah, well, thank you. So yeah, the reality is maybe I just been wired, having worked on the business side of healthcare. I've been wired to think in terms of business terms when it comes to what diversity represents. Yes, it has become a moral imperative after the murder of George Floyd, and that's important. But for a long time, we have seen the demographic changes, dating back 3 decades now. If we look at Massachusetts or Greater Boston, the population would be stagnant if it were not for the growth of Black, Latinx, Asian populations. So, I mean, that by itself is the most compelling case for this work. How do we tap into those customer segments? How do we do so in a relevant way, culturally, linguistically? So from when I started down this path, I always saw it as a business case, a very compelling business case. And in fact, when I started in the official role of diversity officer, my title, this is back to Tufts Health Plan, was business diversity officer. I don't think anyone's used that term before, but I was very intentional about the word business because, quite frankly, if you think about how health insurance works and how healthcare works, if you're able to increase top line revenue, right, which is the case with these fast growing populations, if you're able to then address health disparities and reduce medical costs, you have a margin proposition, right? So when you put it in those terms and you articulate what the gap is, if your customer population is underrepresented, then you get the attention of your CFO, your CEO, and others. And then you're also able to do that great mission work. You often hear, no mission without margin. I think there's a very compelling case for this work if you spend the time, whatever industry you're in, if you spend the time making that case. And of course, the moral imperative, I think, has become so pronounced that it makes it easier, but I think it makes it sustainable if you can make it both a margin and mission equation.
Excellent, Juan. I want to go back to you, Kirk, on that same notion of DEI, but maybe just in terms of the healthcare system or health system. We know that one of the revelations we had in the last 19 months or so with COVID-19 was that we needed to have folks who speak their language, folks who may come from their country, folks who are Black and brown, reach out to folks to convince them on the efficacy and safety of these drugs, to convince them to get contact tracing, or now to convince them just to show up to get a vaccine, and then now to get a vaccine for their child. What is it that we've been struggling with this pipeline issue about whether it's the pharmaceutical side or the provider side? Why are we still, and to this day and age, I think it's 4% of the medical doctors in this country come from historically Black colleges and universities and Latin universities, Puerto Rico. Why is it that we're still struggling to turn out a pipeline, a robust pipeline of Black and brown folks who share the lived experiences of the patients that they're treating, or bring that to the policy conversations in the spaces they're in? Yes, that's for you.
Okay, I wasn't sure it was going back to Eddie. Yeah. Oh, there's a whole lot there. Yeah. First thing I want to say though is a question people asked of me. I won't take too long. The person that questions after me is I'm the executive sponsor for the Leaders of Color at my organization. It was over 600 members. It was phenomenal what the company did at the time with post George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and all the others, Sandra Bland, everybody. And that's basically they asked me, is this the same as the 60s? Well, I'm too young really to know exactly, what happened in the 60s. But the point is, why George Floyd? Eric Gardner in Staten Island was choked to death by a police officer around his neck saying, I can't breathe, and was choked to death. That didn't stop the world. So what's the difference? I think we can't underestimate the impact of COVID and the shutdown that hyper-focused us all. We didn't have sports, we didn't have music, we didn't have many newspapers, we didn't have singing, we didn't have dance, we didn't have clubs, movies, all of that. We had to focus on what was in front of us, and that was the murder on television. Thank God she filmed it. So that made us look at what the horror is, and then to your point, everyone got woke. Now, people got woke. Okay, well, young people, I've got children in my family young, they're not necessarily going to take a whole lot of abuse because they grew up with stuff. And they're not going to sit back and say, you've taken this back away from me. I'm used to growing up with certain stuff that maybe we just got and our parents didn't have. So then you have to say, well, am I going to go to a school? Am I going to go into a program? Am I going to go into a 14-year journey in medicine to be treated like crap or have to do with racism or this, that, to be told I'm not good, to come out with $200,000 in loans or whatever else for a dream, when I can do X, Y, and Z and maybe get there faster or at least half the way? I think that's part of it. We've seen an influx of brilliant young people of color, Black people, Latinx people go into HBCUs, yay. But why? Because a lot of them say, I don't want to deal with the racism on the predominantly white campuses. That's good and it's bad. That's good and it's bad for all the reasons we know. So I think I've been looking at this data and I've been on the panels about why is it, why is it that we're not giving people of color, Black folks into the medical school programs, especially Black men? And I think that's part of it. And there are options. There are other options, that folks can go into. Solution: start early. How many people see the Black guy in the coat, the Black woman in the white coat, going to work every day, succeeding, on panels, talking, being called doctor? How many people see that? Let's start early. Let's start in elementary school and middle school, and not wait till someone's 20 and figure out, we're going to try to not so much turn you around, but give you an opportunity to get on that 14-year journey. You have to start early.
Thank you, Doctor. I just want to restate that. I think the data point is that of all the doctors that are being turned out and then put into the profession, a majority of them still come from historically Black and Latinx institutions. And that I think the percentage is about 4% of the doctors practicing across this country reflect the folks that are on this call. So disturbing and troubling.
Can I say
I
one
wanted
thing?
Yeah, go ahead.
Really, really quickly, because I want to make sure I'm clear that I literally was on a panel, Augustus A. White, on the third lecture, annual lecture over at BI, Harvard Medical School, and this exact topic came up, and it was also along the lines that Black folks and Black students in general aren't treated the same necessarily, in the interview process. And people say, oh, no. But when you have conscious and unconscious bias and someone's interviewing you, you have to get past that step in order to get to the residency, to get to the medical school. So we need to build more allies. Yes, I said it. We need to build more allies in order to overcome the biases that someone sees someone like me, someone like you sitting there, and they're like, well, I don't know, because they've never dealt with me before like this. So I think we need that as well. Sorry to interrupt there.
No, I'm glad. And I want to get to Augustus White in a second. You made me think as well, a brother at Urban League of Eastern Massachusetts under former Chancellor, now Keith Motley, said at a panel discussion that a few of us was at, Paul Francisco was there with us that day. He said it took a pandemic and being forced to stay at home to give us 20/20 vision. To your point earlier, right? That we couldn't ignore 9 minutes and 29 seconds with a knee on your neck. We now had to see that played over and over and over again. We now had to see in the top right-hand corner of that screen on CNN, the infection and the death rates and see the numbers playing out along lines that were definitely racial and ethnic. And you're right. I think it's a powerful thing that we need to take from this pandemic is it forced us to pay attention. Now, you know, we have attention deficit disorder in this country when it comes to racism. So it doesn't take long for us to focus on something else and then to get, as Juan said earlier, weathered again to the conditions we're in. So I think this conversation is critical for that. Eddie, I need to get your perspective as well, brother, for the work that you're doing at Blue Cross. Blue Cross is, and me having, for those who didn't know, worked at Blue Cross for many years, Eddie, I know that the work they've done around diversity, equity, inclusion has also been pretty groundbreaking and a challenge, right? Even your best of institutions trying to figure this stuff out. Give me your perspective on the DEI work, and then I want to get into the Augustus White and talk a little bit about what that is.
Yeah, definitely. There's a lot of that's happening in the way of DE&I here at Blue Cross. And internally, there's a framework. You guys will start to pick this up from my responses to these questions, but we love frameworks at Blue Cross Blue Shield of Massachusetts. And there's a framework we apply to our DE&I efforts. And it speaks to both the business case, as Juan was sort of alluding to or had mentioned, and the strategy for that work. Internally, it's our own version of the 5 C's. There's commerce, community, culture, career, and there's care. And we have a lot of fantastic work happening in each of those areas. Some examples, we recently released a report that outlines the work we're doing to diversify our suppliers and vendors, right? This report showed that over the past 5 years, I think it was, we've increased the number of diverse suppliers we're doing business with. It's up 23%. We've also invested a lot of resources, time, and energy to support COVID vaccine access in underserved communities across the Commonwealth. All of our associates that interact with our customers receive cultural competency training this year. I know there are plans to expand that for next year. And then by the end of this year, all of our leaders will have completed a 21-day racial equity habit immersion program, which I was a part of one of the first groups that went, and it was, I mean, just phenomenal. But I think, you know, I would close by saying to Juan's point, it actually makes good business sense, DE&I. And I think the sooner organizations realize that, the better off they are.
Thank you, Eddie. Very helpful. And for those who don't know, and again, I give Blue Cross credit to this, Lenny Zakem, who many know from the Anti-Defamation League many years ago, started a Brene Brith, if I pronounce that correctly, program where they did the train-the-trainer sessions around diversity. And this, we're going back probably 20 years ago, maybe 25 years ago. And Blue Cross was one of the first organizations in the state and one of the first in the country to sign up to train, Eddie. Every employee had to go through a 4 or 8 hour training back then, when this was not the common practice, way before the George Floyds, way before this racial justice awareness that we have today. So again, credit to your colleagues at Blue Cross for leading us there. I'm going to take a little pivot. First, I want to talk about the Augustus White Institute. Then I want to give a little bit of a broad question. So can folks tell me what their perspective is? There's, as Juan and I've talked about, we've never seen this many Black and Latinx leaders and others of color in key positions in healthcare and health. We've never seen it. And now major hospital systems, major pharmaceutical companies, name it, clinics, so forth, have representation that have now power. And I always reference back on Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley's quote that she's known across the country for. She says, those closest to the pain should be closest to the power. That's actually becoming real. That we are, like the three of you on this call, you're in positions of power and you bring that lived experience. In that, there are people coming to the table. Our Medicaid waiver in Massachusetts has some key provisions that are drafted around health equity. Health Policy Commission, which is a Massachusetts-based entity, looking at critical issues in our healthcare system, is looking at conversations around health equity. Across the country, as many of you know, people are starting to think and pivot to figure this health equity piece. I want to just lift up the Augustus White Institute. If any of you want to kind of speak to what that institute is, just give it a few minutes of reflection on what it's going to do in this work.
Yeah, I I can start. Yes, I'm on the board of that, and we just really launched it August 19th at the Vineyard event. And basically, it's an institute that goal is to create programs and opportunities for marginalized people, especially marginalized people, to get healthcare equity, to get equitable healthcare across the board, regardless to race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, height, eye color, whatever, to make sure that we have access and we provide access to people, regardless of what their backgrounds are. How are you going to do something like this? Well, collaborating with hospitals, with community centers, with fraternities, sororities, churches, senior centers, civic organizations like the Urban League and Keith Motley, and of course, who's one of our advisors as well, and NAACP, bringing all this together under the brainchild, the genius of Augustus A. White, who was one of the first Black students at Brown University, and then on the football team as well. Then the first Black medical student at Stanford, and the first Black resident in the Yale residency program, surgical, and then on to Harvard, became the chairman of the orthopedic department over at BI Harvard Medical School. All of that, and he's not alone. There are a few others who did those types of things, but he stayed centered and focused. A man that grew up in Memphis, Tennessee, in the Jim Crow South, who knew exactly what it was to be on the other side of the tracks, to bring people forward, to not say, I'm just looking forward, I'm also looking back. So with that, he loves the word, and we love the word. I think all the people on this panel of the world, humanitarian health. If you think of people as human, the word equity just follows. Healthcare for all. And, we are putting on a program November 10th, and send out the flowers on the website, aawinstitute.org, called Body, Mind, and Spirit, a healthy approach to the holidays. Because it's, first of all, it's timely, and I think it's obvious from the title. It's not just your physical health, it's your mental health, and it's also how you approach yourself from an exercise perspective as well. So to me, all of this is important. All of this helps to bring health equity. And I'd love to hear other people's thoughts. And we're partnering with BI, we're partnering with Blue Cross Blue Shield, anyone, all are welcome, but we need everyone to participate in this because it's starting in Boston, but it's going national.
And I want to go to Juan next, but I'll say a quick comment. So one is a good friend of mine, Macy Russell. Folks know Macy's one of the key architects behind the Augustus White Institute. But what they may not know is he's a partner in crime with the NAACP for many years, doing this civil rights, social justice work. So credit to you, Kirk, and the rest of the team at the Augustus White Institute. We're waiting for this. We're waiting for that kind of leadership. Juan, you've been aware of the work of the Augustus White Institute, but you've also been in many other spaces that you're leading and collaborating around, not, as we say, missing the moment. We want to meet the moment. Give a little bit of perspective on what that work looks like.
Yeah. So first off, we're so excited about the Gus White Institute and the work that will come out of that. And I'm with the Beth Israeli Health System, so we're following closely the great work being done there. And we have Dr. Jack Carter, who's a key sort of co-chair of that work and a longtime champion for equity within the Beth Israel system. So thrilled to see that work. It's an exciting time. There's just, Mike, as you said, there's just a new generation of leaders. We have been mentored by so many of these amazing champions that were the first of everything that you have done. We can really, at this current moment, take some significant steps towards getting to an equitable place. But it requires that we come together, that our Latin community, Black community, other minority communities come together and leverage what is still a relatively small but growing number of us in leadership roles. So there's a number of other exciting efforts worth calling out, and Paul Francisco is very involved with one of them, the new Commonwealth Fund for Racial Justice. There's a similar fund, philanthropic fund that was established in 2013 for the Latino community. It's the only local philanthropic effort focused exclusively on the Latino community, and I'm the co-chair of that, the Latino Equity Fund. So we have this moment in time now where there's significant philanthropic interest in this work. There's a lot of allies that want to support this work. So that's where we look to seize this moment by through collaboration, where none of us can do this alone. I'm a Betis Religi Health. One of the first conversations I had, and on my first week on the job, was with my counterpart over at the competitor company, their competitor system, Mass General Brigham. I connected with Dr. Elsie Taveras there, and we said, well, how do we collaborate on health equity? We could compete on everything else, but health equity is a team sport. How do we collaborate on that? And that's led to many other conversations that we're continuing to have with Mike, with literally about almost 36 of us who are saying this is the moment in time to really make sustainable systemic change. And it's not going to be any one entity. It's going to be the combination of us, combination of our voices that will make it happen. So excited about what's to come, but it does require a lot of coordination.
And you make me think, Juan, for those of us who are students of history, right? When those folks came together for the March on Washington, when those folks came together for the Freedom Rides, it was born out of movements like this, right? People in key positions and key places trying to meet the moment. I think that's what we're seeing by these brothers on the call today and other men and women across the healthcare sector. How can we bring all of our privilege, all of our resources, all of our passion around health equity together to actually eliminate health inequity in this country? So I am excited on that. I want to just remind what Dr. Taylor said, mind, body, and spirit. He put the link up, November 10th. I just registered, Dr. Taylor, myself today. So I'll be there for the discussion. Eddie, I want to go back to you. One of the things I ask often on panel discussions, and I want your perspective on this, and then we'll close out with that from Juan and Kirk as well. Is this a moment or a movement? Is this a moment or a movement?
Let's hope for the latter. Let's hope for the latter. Yeah, let's hope for the latter. I guess I'll leave it there.
What are you seeing, Eddie, that makes you even hopeful that it could be a movement?
So I'll say it's interesting. Internally, there are so many different things, and a lot of what we used to raise earlier on sort of fell on deaf ears. And what you've noticed is not only are people starting to listen, but even more so, we're having these, what I guess would have been uncomfortable conversations. There's more of a willingness to have those. And I know in some of the stuff we're doing internally, I mean, man, there are conversations happening in this environment that I thought would never, ever happen in the workplace. And so people are actually listening, and then they're actively participating in those conversations. It's so different now, but we can't let this pass. We have to take advantage. While we have the ears and we see some action, we've got to take advantage of it.
Thank you, Eddie. It's up to us. Kirk, moment or movement?
Oh, movement. And I've said that at work, and my company, I've been told in the last 2 years, what we've been able to accomplish because of the moment, which has led to a movement, has been more than people have been able to do in 8 years. No judgment. It just is what it is. Take the moment, seize it, and keep it going. And also, I look at the young people in my family, the 20-year-olds, a bunch of them in the early 20s. They're not taking crap. And they are marching. And I was afraid. I was like, okay, going out there, we knew what was going on with the police and some of these other counter people during the Trump era that were setting out there. And I couldn't stop them. And you brought up one of the pivotal moments in my history, and that's the Freedom Rise. What do I mean by that? I wasn't on the Freedom Rise, but I was in medical school. I was feeling burnt out. I was like, And I turned the TV on. TV was on PBS, and I looked over, and it was that Eyes on the Prize with the Freedom Riders. And I watched that episode. And I said, if they can do that, those 18, 19, 20-year-olds, and go in there blind and be killed, beaten, I can sit my butt here and read this and suck it up and try to do well. How can I stop my 20-year-old godchildren and children in the family, from going out there? Women, girls included, women included. How can I stop them? Because if we did that, we wouldn't have had SNCC, right? So it's a movement. It's a movement. And they're still talking about it. And they showed me pictures of tanks in San Francisco prior to the day of the marches. So it's a movement. You got me emotional when I think about, you mentioned SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee.
I sat next to Julian Bond as a member of the National NAACP Board of Directors. I sat next to him for 3 hours while we were voting and interviewing candidates for the National NAACP President and CEO role. When I tell you, Kirk, he gave me history packaged in 3 hours. We were supposed to be paying attention, but he was educating me on the movement. And of course, we got to meet, many of us had a chance to meet John Lewis, an architect of the civil rights movement, and of course, talking about good trouble. I'm going to close it out with you, Juan. I know maybe a minute. You've been thinking about this. You and I have been spending time talking about whether this is a movement or a moment. I'd love for you to reflect, share your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I'm optimistic it is a movement. The caveat I have is that we need accountability across the board. We need to have those actions include a scorecard. And we need to look 5 years from now and have a way to measure whether we move the dial on health equity. 5 years from now and see whether we move the dial on representation within our organizations, private, public. We need to look 5 years from now and see if we move the dial on economic equality. What does that look like? So I think we need to create those mechanisms to hold each other accountable, hold our allies accountable. And I think that's when we'll be able to not only realize the movement, but be able to measure that movement.
And I'll turn it over to Emerson. So I want to take the privilege, the opportunity today to acknowledge Emerson, Foster, and Paul Francisco. When we talk about whether this is a movement or a movement, for any of us who've done civil rights work, we understand that the impetus for the movement is conversation, it's awareness, it's education. And Emerson and Paul have been doing something that I think too few people understand the importance of. That if you can get really smart people in a room to talk about really critical issues, it raises the consciousness of the people who are watching, and they take that back to their spaces. They take that back and they vote differently. They hire differently. They work differently in their community. So Emerson, Paul, thank you for the tremendous amount of work, particularly with the Men of Color Conference 2021. And I'm going to turn it over to you, Emerson.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Michael. And Eddie, Kirk, Juan, we knew what we were getting when we enlisted all of you to have this conversation. I was, as you guys were talking about your connections and the work you're doing together, I was reflecting on, Paul and I and others have been around this work and, this work, DE&I work in this region for quite some time. And I was, as I was listening to you all, I was faulting us because ultimately, I'm seeing the strategy come into play now. I'm seeing, kind of the stickiness to the work that probably was not there in some of our early work, right? And so, Kirk, the passion around, hey, yeah, this is a movement, and we're going to ensure that it remains a movement, as opposed to, we're in our own corners doing our thing. You guys are collectively coming together to make sure that there's muscle behind it, that there's energy behind it, and it doesn't wane. So I just, I applaud all of you, and I'm energized by the work that I know that you're doing, and that we're here in support of all that. So thank you for coming and lending your voice to this very, 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 very important discussion. One question just back to the pipeline issue around medical professionals and folks of color not being represented there in the way that they should be. What are the institutions doing to support that? Right. So what are companies, medical facilities, et cetera, doing to support that? Or is it just up on it's just on the candidates and the educational institution to prepare the candidate? How are institutions really supporting more development of doctors of color?
Maybe if I could chime in first and then turn it over to my colleagues. So one is, and this is breaking news, as some may know, last night, the Massachusetts legislature was meeting on a plan to do something with the ARPA funding, that federal funding, American Recovery Plan funding. And of course, Massachusetts is slated to get a significant pot of money from Massachusetts. And one of the things that includes, Emerson, is workforce dollars. and particularly workforce dollars to create a robust, diverse pipeline of providers. That's loan repayment. We know that if you're Black and brown in this country, and you're maybe, if you are fortunate, you're first and second generation middle class, you've had some opportunity. But that is significant debt, as Dr. Taylor knows, to go to medical school, to go through that process, the sacrifice. We have to build in incentives. We have to be able to provide the infrastructure so that Black and brown folks can decide, I want to pursue that career, and then I want to serve my community, not going to specialty care. I want to do primary care. I want to be located at Whittier Street. I want to be in Mattapan. I want to be in Chelsea, Lynn, Lawrence, Springfield, Worcester. And part of the way we do that is investing in talent, investing in people who want to live and serve their communities.
Nice.
Yeah, so powerful. Wow, yeah, that's an hour right there, Emerson. Your question. This is an hour.
Yeah.
Really quickly, so let the other brothers talk. It has to be the loan forgiveness. I'm sort of jumping into the middle of the argument there then, and it's been on the docket now since I was a kid, so 20 years, 30 years. In order to really get more Black and brown, not one, just to get into the schools is loan forgiveness, but two, to not go into orthopedics, radiology, cardiology, cardiothoracic surgery, whatever. Why? Because if you come out with loans, you need to get that big salary to pay them off, but also to live well. You put in, like, literally 14 years after high school, and you're telling me I'm going to make, no disrespect, average money? No, I want to make big money, right? So we're going to have to do that. I can say for my company, we've been dealing with this, and again, huge shout out, EMD Serona, but Merck, KGAA, globally, and that we created the Merck Scholars Program. And what that is Black and brown ethnic employees can apply for their children and grandchildren for a $5,000 a year scholarship for 4 years. So they have to have a certain GPA, 3.5 and above, in certain criteria, but they put in. And we had our first tranche this year. We had over 20 applicants, and it was a rigorous process. We filled it all out. We had an external group bring it down to 10. We then evaluated internally, and we were able to award 5. And we plan to keep doing this. So that's one way that, crass quote, put your money where your mouth is, show your resources. The company is backing it. Start early, give these people a chance. That $5,000 off the tuition, the books, it's expensive, but it gives folks hope that someone believes in them. Oh, along with that, we are also giving them a summer internship. So when you finish in June, what is it, May, June, you can come and work. And maybe if you're great, and we may hire you later on. So it's a nice pipeline.
Hey, Eddie and Juan, Eddie and Juan and Mike, maybe you can kind of wrap it up in a bow thereafter. 10 years from now, considering the work that you're all doing, what do you see in the most optimistic lens, through the most optimistic lens you can look through? What do you see, Eddie, Juan, Michael?
I'd say, back to the 3 major areas where I want to see progress. I started with representation, getting closer to 5 to 10 years from now, representation in leadership, representation in patient-facing roles, physicians, nurses. The gap is so significant that 5, 10 years from now, if we are able to close that gap by half, I think we've made some good progress, and we'll see better outcomes. There's plenty of research that shows that if your provider shares your language, your ethnicity, your culture, I think your outcomes, you're more open to care. So that's one. The second one, beyond representation, is the health equity that we spend a lot of time talking about. We need a composite way, an aggregated way to measure health equity, the way we measure other aspects of healthcare. And 5, 10 years from now, being able to see how we've closed that gap. And if we haven't, who's being held accountable? Who's being penalized or rewarded, whatever characteristic you want to use. We don't have any of that right now. And then the third is back to economic inclusion. We've heard the often quoted, $8 versus $250,000 in terms of median net worth for a Black and white household. How do we, next time we run that report 10 years from now, what does that look like?
Nice.
I think Juan nailed it. I mean, I would go back to the health inequities and a lot of the work that is happening at our health plan to help close some of those gaps, being honest about that conversation and transparent about putting that information out there so people can see what it is. I mean, it's, putting that sort of information out to the public can be taken a lot of ways. But I think many of us who are doing a lot of this work look at it and see opportunity. And so, I think Juan nailed it perfectly.
Nice.
And I'll kind of wrap it up on this. Rebecca Lee Crumpler was the first African-American female physician of the 19th century. She worked during Reconstruction. Black woman, right? Imagine the challenges, right, of being Black and a woman during that period of time. And she is known for a quote. She said, "They seem to forget that there's a reason for every ailment and that it's within their power to do something about it." So when I think about my background, as Paul, Emerson, and Juan know, I come from a housing development, Lenox Street in Boston. I looked around my neighborhood. Many of us were incarcerated. My uncles were all locked up. Many of my aunts and uncles were dying of diabetes and heart disease and cancer, living 5, 10, 15 years less. We were poor. We were food insecure. We were on welfare. We were getting kicked out of school, expelled, suspended. None of that made sense to me, and I internalized it. I was like, okay, something must be wrong with us, until I got that history and that context, right? Because then it all made sense that we're not here by accident. I think to our panelists today, I think what this is all about is really bringing that context so then we can do something about it. So I want to start with understanding 5, 10 years from now, Emerson, I hope that we raise the consciousness of Americans, not just Black and Latinx Americans, Americans, so that we don't blame and shame folks for the conditions they're in. We then provide the solutions that we need.
Man, that's Mike, that statement is, runs across each one of our panel discussions. If you heard Michael Eric Dyson yesterday, it was woven through his message. If you heard Keith this morning, Keith Ellison, it was woven through his message. So I just think that's a great bow to this conference. So thank you, brothers, for just wrapping us up in the way that we knew that you would, and really providing, kind of a great close to the conference. To all the attendees, one, we want to thank you all for joining. Paul and I couldn't have been more happy with what we were able to put together with these 2 days. I want to thank Christian Neal, and Christian may pop in at some point, but none of this would have been possible without Christian in the background, and also another young lady who I know very well, Miss Anna Foster. None of this would have been possible without the two of them really supporting Paul and I through this. Want to thank all the panelists, all the speakers. Every panel knocked it out of the park. Terrific information, a lot for us to kind of go back and chew on. I hope that we all feel activated and energized by some of the information that we received over the last 2 days. Certainly want to thank Attorney General Keith Ellison. Can't be more thankful for that brother and the work he's put in the last couple of years to make sure that the reckoning for what happened to Brother Floyd came to being. So thank him for that. And always, Michael Eric Dyson is who he is, and he just presented some great nuggets for us to kind of think about. I want to thank all of our sponsors, and I want to, if you just bear with me, I want to go through our list of sponsors, because again, none of this would have been possible without them. Point 32 Health in Takeda, our lead sponsors, our change agent sponsors, and those two organizations, I can definitely say, are change agents. We have ally sponsors, Thermo Fisher Scientific, Manulife / John Hancock, our two ally sponsors. Our champion sponsors, Dana-Farber Cancer Institute, Sage Therapeutics, Cambridge Savings, Blue Cross and Blue Shields of Massachusetts, thank you, Eddie. Wellington Management, Beth Israel Leahy, thank you, Juan. Sanofi, Capital One, Eastern Bank, TD Bank, Mass General Brigham, our leader sponsors, Commonwealth Financial, Foundation Medicine, Boston Scientific, Vertex, Cambridge Health Alliance, GVC, thank you, Greg Almeida, a big arm, a big support behind the scenes here, Biogen, and our supportive sponsors, Rockland Trust and Acadian, thank you all for your support of this conference. Just so that you know, we, as you know, we had to pivot to this virtual engagement. We are looking to fast follow with an event in the summertime, puts us on a different cadence from a timing perspective. But it's our hope that we can actually come together in person in the summertime and have this engagement again in the summertime. And we have, if we were able to pull off what we're looking to pull off, it's going to be a tremendous session that we'll have for you all in the summertime. On November 18th, for our sponsors, and again, thank our sponsors, we will have our career event that typically is tied to the conference. We're going to have that on a separate day on November 18th. We're still working on the complete construct of that, but all the sponsors will be available to be engaged around career opportunities at their organizations. As you heard, these are some of the leading companies in our region, and there's some terrific career opportunities at these organizations. So look out for content and communication on that. And again, November 18th. And right now you can actually, in our last newsletter, there are links to their open jobs. You can kind of preview some of their job openings that they currently have. And then I mentioned this summer. So last and again, not least, just want to thank all you attendees for attending and receiving this content. Very much appreciated. Paul, any last words?
And just the committee that behind the scenes also helped you and I put this together. So all the brothers that were in those calls at 5 p.m. Every Thursday with us, sort of helping us design this, and you know who you are. You're critical to this. So Em and I can't do this by ourselves, and similar to what Em's recognizing Anna and Christian, there's a number of you who have been involved in supporting this, and this for all of us. So thank you for attending, and we look forward to seeing you in the summer, and even prior to the summer, hopefully having an event or two, at least here in Boston. And thank you to the brothers and Charlotte and Atlanta as well for supporting. And Rhode Island, Providence.
Don't forget the hey. Go
Yeah,
voting.
I know.
Go voting.